I still think Chardonnay makes the best dry white wines in the world, and therefore also the best dry white wines in New Zealand, but I'm biased. And I think Chardonnay styles have evolved dramatically in the last 30 years to really reflect the sites in which they're grown. It is one of the few grape varieties that grows successfully in every region in New Zealand, from the very far north right down to central Otago, and makes unique expressions of Chardonnay within all of those regions. We've been making serious Chardonnay here since the late 1970s, when it became a very popular grape variety. But at the time, our winemaking was very much influenced by the Germanic school of enology, where white wine was made in stainless steel tanks at cold temperatures, and then somebody thought, well, in Burgundy they use barrels, and so the wine initially was fermented in stainless steel and then aged in barrels. And what happens then is that the wine extracts or over-extracts the oak characters and becomes quite oxidized. So it wasn't until a few winemakers started investigating how white wine was made in Burgundy that we started to look at barrel fermentation and other techniques for making Chardonnay. Many of the early examples of New Zealand Chardonnay from the 1980s were made in barrels, and when a little bit of something like oak is good, then often the temptation becomes, well, a whole lot of it must be great. And there was a tendency to the overuse of oak. That has moderated in more recent times, and now the use of oak is much more subtle and in harmony with all the other characters of the wine. And I think our wines these days are much better for it. With the overuse of oak early on, there was a reactionary movement towards what they call unoaked or unwooded styles of Chardonnay, and most of those were a bit disappointing in that they were quite fruity, but relied too much on yeast character and not enough on the textural elements of this grape variety. More recently, people have gone back to making unoaked styles of Chardonnay, but using stainless steel tanks or concrete tanks or eggs, and allowing the wine to age on the yeast lees for an extended period of time and make a more flinty, more mineral style of Chardonnay that doesn't rely so much on oak. And that style, we could call it a Chablis or Chablisian style, is becoming much more popular these days. So a few winemakers started investigating the type of barrels to use for Chardonnay. At the time, local coopers were few and far between, and most of the barrels for New Zealand wine came from Australia. Some started to be imported directly from France, and these were the traditional 225 litre barriques or 228 litre PS from Burgundy, and better quality barrels. So Chardonnay was starting to be pressed, put into barrels and allowed to ferment in barrels. And straight away the technique was different because the temperature was higher, you didn't get the same degree of fruity characters coming from the yeast, and then other techniques were investigated as well, which included the use of wild yeast instead of the selected culture yeasts, and the use of malolactic fermentation. Barrel fermentation is when you put the juice directly into a barrel and allow the fermentation to start, and then the yeast population grows and the fermentation proceeds in conjunction with a new or newish barrel, and so the wood characters that get into the wine are much more subtle and integrated than if you make the wine first in a stainless steel tank and then put it into a barrel. And this was an immediate improvement in the texture and the character of barrel fermented Chardonnay wines in New Zealand. pure yeast culture technology was very much in vogue in the 1980s. The Australian wine industry really had pioneered in many ways the use of selected cultures and sterilised cultures to give the wine a particular character and a known strain of yeasts. And that really did result in an improvement in wine quality. But it wasn't until the mid-1980s where a few of us started experimenting with wild yeast, using all of the yeast microflora from the vineyard and the grapes to make the wines, that things started to change. So instead of relying on the estery characters that come from yeast, we started looking at what would happen if you used a wild fermentation. And wild fermentations are a progression of different yeast species and different yeast strains that actually fall into the background. The yeast characters become less prominent and allows the character of the grape variety in the vineyard to come to the fore. And so it has become quite a popular technique, particularly for Chardonnay wines. I think the key to making really good Chardonnay is to ripen it properly in a cool climate so that you get right flavours but you still retain acidity to such an extent where some form of deacidification is almost always necessary. And the way we choose to deacidify is through the use of malolactic fermentation. Malolactic fermentation is the transformation by bacteria of malic acid in the juice and during the fermentation into lactic acid, which is a softer tasting, less strong acid. And so the acidity reduces, it makes the wine more palatable, but it also introduces a flavour and aroma of butter. The compound diacetyl is responsible for this, and it's also very important in dairy products. And the initial use of malolactic fermentation in New Zealand Chardonnay always resulted in this buttery character. But we've now learnt how to modify that. It really is just by allowing the wine to age for a longer period of time on the yeast lees, because the yeast, even though they may be dead, are still capable of consuming the diacetyl that produces the butteriness. So the longer we can keep the wine in contact with the yeast lees, the less buttery it becomes, and it still retains fruit freshness and vibrancy. One aspect of New Zealand Chardonnay in recent times has been the use of reductive characters, or the retention of reductive characters in the Chardonnay wine style. This really comes about through the use of more grape solids in the fermentation. If you don't clarify the juice before fermentation and incorporate more of the grape solids, then you tend to have more elemental sulphur coming into the wine, and as a result you get these reductive characters, sulphides, benzene methyl sulfide, which can be very attractive in low concentrations because they're quite flinty, quite expressive of the variety as well, but you can overdo it. And I think in many cases in the last few years the pendulum swung too far, but in more recent times it's coming back where the wine still has some reductive aromas but is much more in balance. Too much reduction also shortens the palate, can make the palate taste a bit bitter. So keeping these things in balance is very important for the complexity of a grape variety like Chardonnay. So what is it about New Zealand Chardonnay that's unique in the world? Well, Chardonnay is a grape variety that originated in Burgundy, and we really do take our cues from that white wine style, and we have learnt a lot from that. But every region in New Zealand has its own peculiar characteristics, its own ability to ripen Chardonnay, and the techniques that have been used have evolved to express those site differences as well. Although I must say that most of the techniques used these days by winemakers the length of the country are very similar. Many people use wild yeasts, many people use barrels. Malolactic fermentation is pretty common, and What we see with these cool climate wine styles is a vibrancy, a nice ripeness of fruit, but not losing that essential acidity and liveliness on the palate that makes it go with food. And that really is the hallmark, I think, of the great white wines of Burgundy as well. Chardonnay is a fantastic grape variety in that it gives this texture that seems to improve with age as well. But more importantly, on the aroma, you can get this wide variety of characters, a spectrum of flavours and aromas that change with different regions and different ripeness levels. So you can go from the lemon, lime, the citrus end of things right through to orange peel, grapefruit, then up into stone fruits, nectarines, peaches, white flesh peach, yellow flesh peach, right into apricot. And that really is, to me, the flavour spectrum. And when it gets really ripe, you've got melon-like characters, yellow flesh melon-like characters. And we can find all of those in the various regions in New Zealand. And it gives an amazing palette of expression that winemakers can work with. And then they can work with things like the time of harvest, because if you pick earlier, you're more on the left end of the spectrum. If you pick a bit later in warmer areas like Hawke's Bay, then you're much more in the peach end of the spectrum. But in every case, we get this nice vibrant acidity that balances the ripeness. And that's one of the unique characters of New Zealand as a country, because we are very much a cool climate viticultural region.